Hello everyone and welcome to the video. So yesterday WoW patch 10.2 finally came out, and with it came a lot of nice changes for Disc Priest. So in this video we're going to be going over all the changes and what it really means for PvP, as well as breaking down the talent tree, gear, stat priority, and the general rotation of how Disc should be played in PvP. So for starters, we're going to go over all the nerfs that happened to Disc Priest because there were a few changes that did inherently nerf the spec. So nerf number one across all pre-specs, Mass Dispel is now a 2-minute cooldown. It no longer has the fast cast option either. There is a talent, a PvP talent that reduces the cooldown by 1 minute, but you're probably not going to play it because your other PvP talents are more valuable. That's number one. Number two, Shadow Covenant is no longer an active ability. So Shadow Covenant was pretty good because when you were worried about getting kicked, if let's say two melees were on you and they both had kick up, you can just, press Shadow Covenant and then cast Penance, which would be on the Shadow School. And then if you got kicked on Penance, you can free cast on Holy or vice versa. So that's another nerf. And so what Shadow Covenant does now is whenever you use either Shadow Fiend or Mindbender, it'll turn you into the Shadow form, making your Penance and Divine Star, whatever, all of those don't really matter. It'll turn them into Shadow and they'll do 25% more. Doesn't really matter because we're not going to be using it in PvP anymore, since Shadow Fiend is a really long cooldown and you're not going to invest enough points to go all the way into Mindbender. I could see this maybe being a somewhat viable build for twos maybe, because it could potentially do a lot of damage with Mindbender, but quite honestly, I just don't think it's going to be very viable for PvP at least. Another nerf that's coming to Disc Priest this patch is to Powerwood Barrier. So Powerwood Barrier used to be 50% damage reduction in PvP, but now it's going to be 40% damage reduction, and it's going to be 20% in PvE instead of 25%. This is a somewhat significant change, although I don't really think that in practice it'll really make any difference. I think that overall, if you get your dome out and people stand in it, they're probably not going to die. There might be like the odd scenario where they'll die now, whereas they wouldn't have in the past because of the damage reduction difference. But overall, people should not be dying if they're standing in dome, and it's still a good ability. It's unfortunate that it's a 3-minute cooldown and that they took away the PvP talent a while ago to make it a 1.5, but it is what it is. Another small nerf is that Power Infusion is no longer going to last for 20 seconds. It's going to last for 15 seconds, and it gives 20% haste. And then the final nerf to Disc Priest and all pre-specs is going to be Phase Shift. So the tooltip hasn't changed at all, but now when you dispel something like UA or Vampiric Touch, the silencing and fearing effects, those are still going to happen as opposed to being completely immune to them. So it's kind of a big nerf against especially Affliction Warlock, because being able to fade dispel UA every 20 or 25 seconds is really, really strong. But now you can just no longer do it. So you're going to have to be really careful about dispelling UA because you might just blow up for like half your health. So there's a few other significant changes for Disc Priest as well. The first one being that Schism is no longer an active ability. This is kind of nice because Disc Priest damage rotation was getting kind of really long in PvP, and when you just don't have like that many globals to get out like your full rotation, it's kind of nice to have one less ability that you have to cast. So now it'll make your Mind Blast just apply 10% damage buff to the target, and it can get extended by the next talent, although I don't really think it's worth taking because it's only 10% damage, and Mind Blast is a really long cooldown, and yeah, so it's not really worth taking the extra point. That's the other thing. Also, Mind Blast is now a 23-second cooldown, I believe, which gets affected a little bit by haste. So yeah, no more Schism. You'll just Mind Blast, and then you can probably go into Mind Games and maybe Penance. And speaking of Penance, Penance is the number one ability that got changed this patch. Honestly, it's kind of nuts. It's really, really strong now. So for starters, they brought back the Penitence one legendary effect from Shadowlands. So basically, after you use Radiance, you're going to fire 2 extra bolts, and I think there's another thing here. Yeah, Castigation makes you fire 1 additional bolt. So basically, after you Radiance, you're going to be firing a 6-bolt Penance. And then when you add that on top of Power of the Dark Side, making your next Penance 50% stronger, this is a really strong combo. Not to mention, Mind Blast now guarantees Power of the Dark Side. So if I Mind Blast, you're going to see 100% of the time I get Power of the Dark Side here. And then if I Radiance, and my next Penance is going to shoot out 6 bolts, and they're all going to be 50% buffed. So you could see how that can be kind of a lot of damage. On top of that, Penance also got a buff to both its damage and healing in PvP. So let me just double check the numbers. So it's 15% more damage, 30% more healing. So overall, Penance is one of your best both damage and healing abilities now. It's really important. And yeah, it feels really good to play with, honestly. I personally really loved in Shadowlands when we had that legendary, and I'm really glad that they brought it back. This is a huge buff for Disc Priest. One of the main problems with Disc Priest last patch was that it also had really bad healing throughput. And so some of the other changes that this patch brought along was, for example, flash healing now increased by 40%, powered shield absorption by 10%, mixed with the fact that your penance also heals a lot more, and you can get, the 6-bolt penance, and you can reliably proc the power of the dark side by using Mind Blast at least every 20 or so seconds. Overall, it's going to make your healing output just significantly better than it was before. And then the final major change to Disc Priest this patch is Ultimate Penitence. So, in my opinion, so far, from a little bit of testing that I've done in solo shuffles, this ability does feel pretty good to use. It's not really going to be used as like an oh shit, I need to instantly save my whole team kind of button, because it does have a little bit of a cast time, but it's really good if you know that CC is about to come out and you know the enemy team is about to like pop a lot of damage as well. You use this, you can't be CC'd, you get a 50% barrier, and you're just going to keep your whole team top for the next 5 or so seconds while being completely CC immune. So it's a really strong ultimate, and the talent right after it is honestly it's kind of interesting. So to make every penance bolt you fire reduce the cooldown by up to 2 seconds if you put 2 points into it. And because we're going to be firing so many more bolts because of these 6-bolt penance that we're using, I could see this reducing the cooldown of Ultimate Penitence quite a lot, and maybe even enough to get 2 or maybe even 3 per game if it's a longer game. And what's also really nice about Ultimate Penitence is that it costs no mana. So doing that might be really mana efficient. The only problem is that we don't really have any points in our talent tree that we can take out to put into this. So I don't think it's worth taking out anything out over here. And so I don't really think it's going to be worth taking, but there might be, maybe certain scenarios where you would take this just to get more Ultimate Penitences out. Overall, I'd say it's a good ability. It's very fun to use. It's very flashy. And just in case you're not sure, what it does basically is it'll float you up a little bit. It'll just shoot out penance bolts, to like everybody around you for the next like 5 or so seconds, and you become completely CC immune. So really cool ability. It has screwed me over a little bit on the RNG sometimes, where a teammate of mine is like 30% health, and like every single bolt is just hitting the enemy for DPS instead. So there is like a slight bit of RNG to it, but overall it seems like it mostly prioritizes healing allies, especially ones who are a little bit lower HP. I don't know for sure if that's like implemented into the ability, but it kind of seemed like it was. But yeah, overall fun ability, definitely worth taking. And we'll see if there's any kind of like meta evolving over time where you would take Heaven's Wrath just to reduce its cooldown further and further. Because who knows, I'm not really 100% certain how much you can reduce its cooldown. Like maybe instead of every 4 minutes, if you're just spam casting Penance off cooldown, maybe it'll go down to like 1.5 or 2 minutes or so. I'm not too sure, but I guess we'll see over time. And then another major thing for Disc Priest, also this patch, and all healers, is that your PvP trinket is actually a 1.5-minute cooldown now. This is only for healers, but I think that this affects Disc Priest maybe more than any other healer, quite honestly. And the reason I say that is because Disc Priest is the most vulnerable healer of all of them. So we have basically no mobility. We have no real CC other than fear. Like even Holy Priest can like chastise and then fear. So if you're, priest versus priest and you run up to each other, the Holy Priest is always going to win that, because if they're going to stun you, then they're going to fear you. And it kind of becomes like a little mind game between like who's going to fade first. So, you do have some outplay potential, but overall, Disc Priest, most vulnerable healer to CC. And so having the shorter cooldown trinket and letting you get out of CC a lot more often is going to really help us out a lot. So if you're like me, you're probably thinking, what the hell do all these changes really mean at the end of the day for Disc Priest? There's a good mix of nerfs and buffs, a couple new abilities, some abilities taken away. What does it all really mean? Well, in my experience so far doing some solo shuffles at about 2300 MMR, I would say that overall it feels like our healing output is so much better. It's like night and day. It honestly feels like way better. Disc Priest still has their vulnerability. They're still, susceptible to CC, but having the lower cooldown trinket is really helpful, especially against something like Rogue, where some Rogue specs can get blind on a shorter than 2-minute cooldown, and now you'll always have trinket up for blind, so it's not like an auto loss on their second go. But yeah, overall, I think Disc Priest damage is probably a lot lower than it has been in the past, and honestly, our damage does not really seem that significant anymore. You're kind of going to be playing a little bit more like a traditional healer, I think. But yeah, healing throughput way better. We still have really strong defensive cooldowns. That was never really a problem. And Ultimate Penitence does give us an extra option for a big healing throughput cooldown, so that is quite nice. And I think that one of the biggest issues with Disc Priest last patch was honestly just the throughput. We have Fear, it's a good CC ability, we have good utility like Mass Dispel and Power Infusion, and we have like decent burst damage, maybe more than most other healers. But the biggest issue was really just like healing throughput. Sometimes it felt like even though the enemy team isn't really, dumping any cooldowns, sometimes you just could not out heal damage unless you yourself had some kind of external. But once you were out of externals, that was it. Teammates would just fall over, and it doesn't really feel that way anymore. It feels like now, as long as you're not getting kicked, and if you sit back and you get your big penance bolts and you do your rotation properly, that people aren't just going to randomly fall over anymore. And it does feel quite nice. And because a lot of our healing is kind of front loaded on Penance and Powerwood Shield, both really mana efficient abilities, our mana overall also feels significantly better. So before we get into the general gameplay and rotation of Disc Priest this season, let's talk about the stat priority and gear. I think that people are going to continue to stack mostly Mastery and Versatility. In the past, people would play Haste on Disc Priest, but that was mostly to just do more damage. It was really the only stat that would, modify our damage significantly, because we would just be able to cast way more often. Crit is never really worth it in Arena for us because of the 1.x multiplier. It's just not very good. And Haste it just doesn't feel that good anymore either, because we don't really do that much damage anymore. And having more Haste as opposed to Mastery just makes our mana way worse. Like, what would be better, casting one flash heal that's going to do 40% more healing, or casting, 2 flash heals quickly that will do almost the same healing as the one flash heal? Obviously, it's not really quite to that extent, but the point is that you have to cast more spells, which means more mana, and Disc Priest is already by far the worst healer in the game when it comes to mana. So having the extra mastery just means that you don't have to cast less spells to get the same amount of healing out, making you way more mana efficient. Also, it means that your actual spells are just going to individually heal for more. So let's say you have like one global before you get CC'd and you press Radiance. Your Radiance might do like 20 or 30% more healing than it would previously if you were stacking Haste. And that little bit of extra healing might be the difference between a teammate living or dying. So overall, I do think Master. As for embellishments and trinkets, I don't really think anything is changing with that. So personally, I'm using the one on the boots that makes it so that if you juke a interrupt, that you have 4 seconds of not being able to get kicked. And then I have the other one on the belt that makes it so that if you apply a CC or dispel a target, you get a bunch of primary stat. And trinkets, well, obviously you're still going to use medallion, especially that it's better than ever. And then I like to use the insignia because it's just overall more healing throughput throughout the entirety of an arena. So next, let's talk about the overall gameplay and general rotation for both healing and damage in arenas. So not much has really changed, except for there's a little bit more of an emphasis on using Penance than previously, because it did get buffed quite significantly. So your general rotation is going to be Powerwood Shield off cooldown. It's a very mana efficient, very strong heal. Obviously, it's an instant cast as well. And Penance. Penance got a lot stronger, and we're going to be using it probably off cooldown as well. You're going to usually want a Penance only after using a Radiance if you can. And then also every time Mind Blast is off cooldown, you're going to want to use it to guarantee a Power of the Dark Side proc, giving your next Penance 50% more healing or damage. So yeah, those are your two main core abilities. You're going to Flash Heal anytime you get a proc of, what's it called? Surge Light. So every once in a while, you'll just get a free proc of Flash Heal, and it'll make an instant cast and cost no mana. If someone's taking a lot of damage and there's no interrupts available on the team and you can just sit back and free cast, you might actually hard cast Flash Heal from time to time, but it's very mana inefficient and you should only really do it if you absolutely need to. Another thing that's just important in general on Disc Priest is to always have Purge the Wicked up, at least on one, preferably 2 targets. because every time it does damage, it has a chance to proc your Power of the Dark Side as well, and you really want every single penance to be buffed 50% if possible. So yeah, Purge the Wicked on one, maybe two targets. There's also a talent that we have that makes it so that Penance spreads our Purge the Wicked to the nearest target. So here, like if I put Purge the Wicked and I Penance it, it spreads to this nearby target, and then it spreads again. So if people are somewhat close to each other, you can also Purge the Wicked, your kill target, and then Penance them one time, and it'll spread to other people, saving you a little bit of mana, because Purge the Wicked is quite expensive on mana for what it does. Another important part about your healing rotation is going to be Powerwood Life, which actually got a little bit of a change this patch that I forgot to talk about. So how it used to work was if you used it on a target below 35% health, it would do like a really, really big heal, and it would only go on a 10-second cooldown. But if you used it on them above 35% health, it would go on a 30-second cooldown and do almost no healing. Well, you're not going to really have to deal with that anymore, which is really nice, because now it's just always going to be a 15-second cooldown, and it's only usable when they're below 35% health, and it's always going to do like a really, really big heal. The reason why that's really, really good is because there were a lot of times where somebody would be at, let's say, like 30 or 25% health, and then you'd go to use Powerwood Life on them, but they would somehow heal themselves at the same time. Maybe a Warlock Healthstone, or Hunter Exhilaration, or a Death Strike from a Death Knight. Like, most classes have some way of applying healing to themselves. So it would happen really often where they would be like right at the threshold to use Powerwood Life, and then you'd use it, and by the time it goes off, they're above 35% health, and now it's on a 30-second cooldown, and you're in big trouble. But you don't have to deal with that anymore. Anytime somebody is below 35% health, you're going to want to use this off cooldown immediately. It's an instant cast, very low mana cost for how much it heals, and pretty short cooldown. Now let's talk about your external cooldowns and how and when you should be using them. So your external cooldowns are Powerwood Barrier, Rapture, Pain Suppression, which we have 2 charges of because of this one talent that they added a while ago, and now the new Ultimate Penitence. So which one should you be using and when? The way I like to use Rapture, we'll start with, is I see it as an external healing cooldown, especially good for spread damage. So if multiple people are taking damage at the same time, or there's just a lot of damage going out, you can Rapture and just, if you're getting to use your Powerwood Shield off cooldown on a single target, they're never going to die. Like, I don't think any damage in the game can out heal 130k barrier every single global. If it crits, it's like even bigger. I don't think there's anybody in the game, and from my experience, basically when you have Rapture up, nobody's dying. What's really nice about it also is obviously that you cannot get kicked. If you want to Radiance between your Powerwood Barriers, you can do that as well. Personally, what I like to do is, let's say 2 of my teammates are at 50% health. I'll put a barrier on both of them. If by the time my global cooldown is done, their barrier is not broken yet, I'll maybe Radiance, and then if it's still not broken, I'll Penance. If it is broken, I'll just apply another shield, and then I'll Penance. So I'll try to weave in some healing between each shield, but basically making sure that they always have a barrier on them and that their health is never going downwards. And then slowly throughout the duration of Rapture, everybody's health will just go back up to full. The next one is Pain Suppression, and for those who might be new to Priest and maybe new to PvP and you don't know, Pain Suppression can be used while you're stunned. So I will almost never use Pain Suppression if I'm not in a stun, because usually when you get stunned in PvP, there's some kind of follow-up CC. So I'll use Hunters as an example. I think that's a perfect example. A Hunter will pet stun you and then follow up with a trap. Now, you don't always know, especially in solo shuffle, you don't always know if your teammates are going to use something to maybe help you out to not get trapped. But you as a priest, you don't really have any options once you're stunned other than your trinket, which is very valuable. So if I get stunned, I can expect a trap to come, and then they're probably going to do a lot of damage. So while I'm in the pet stun, I'll Pain Suppression whoever their kill target is, and then that person will probably be able to survive the duration of the trap on me. I've had very few instances where I pre-PS somebody and they actually die. And so the same thing also applies if, let's say, you have 2 melees just sitting on top of you all game. Let's say you're playing against a Ret Paladin. On their first Hodge, you're going to Pain Suppression yourself, and that should keep you healthy enough to survive their full CC. And then maybe on the next one, you either paint suppression again, or you can use your trinket that time and then use something else. And then on the third one, vice versa. So you're gonna want to basically alternate between paint suppression and your trinket, and you're never gonna want to use them at the same time. And so the best option you're gonna have most of the time for when you use your trinket is gonna be to pair it with Void Shift. So Void Shift is probably your best "oh shit, my teammate is gonna die, I need to save them" button. Assuming you're at full health, which you're probably going to be all the time, unless the enemy team happens to be targeting you. It's basically just an instant cast full heal on your ally, and it's not even on the Holy School, it's on the Shadow School. So even if you get locked out of Holy, you can use it, and you're very rarely going to be locked out of Shadow, especially now that Schism is gone. So most of the time when you trinket, it's going to be to pair it with Void Shift. You can also trinket and Barrier. That's also a good option if there's like a lot of AoE damage especially, but usually you're going to want to try to use Barrier before getting put in CC. And I think that's basically the best way to use Barrier. Basically, if you see the enemy use their big cooldowns, 2-minute cooldowns, 3-minute cooldowns, or that you're about to get CC'd, let's say you're against a Shadow Priest and you know for a fact that he's walking towards you and his stun and silence just came off cooldown, you can just throw down a barrier on top of your teammates and let yourself get CC'd, and the barrier will keep them alive throughout the duration of pretty much any CC chain. So the last topic we're going to talk about in this video is going to be our DPS rotation. It did get simplified this patch, and quite honestly, our damage has just, I feel like, been getting nerfed more and more over time, and Disc Priest really just does not do that much damage anymore at this point, unless you really spec into it. But basically, our rotation is going to be keep Purge the Wicked on kill target, and then your biggest burst possible is going to be fetching for a buffed 6-bolt Penance. So you're going to Mind Blast, which will do decent damage. You're going to do a Radiance, so you get more Penance bolts. And then you do your big 6-bolt Penance. And then after that, you could do Mind Games. And then basically just look for Shadow Word Death as soon as your kill target becomes below 20% health. And don't forget that because of the talent that we take over here, we get 2 procs of Shadow Word Death. So definitely pretty good execution. And decent burst with the big Penance, but overall sustained damage, not that good. One small thing they did change about Smite as well is that now it has the old effect from Mind Blast in the past, where when you hit an enemy with Smite, it'll absorb a portion of the damage they deal. You can see here absorbs the next 9,300 damage. So if you have free globals and you really have nothing better to do, throwing a Smite out every once in a while is decent. You'll get some atonement healing. You'll do a little bit of damage to the enemy, and it'll prevent a little bit of their damage. So it's not horrible, but definitely low priority. Okay, so I lied. The actual last topic we're going to talk about very briefly is team comps for Disc Priest. So in general, it's pretty straightforward. You don't want to play comps that tend to dampen enemy teams because you do have the worst mana of all the healers in the game. Disc Priests typically want to play with comps that either have a lot of CC, which is why you see a lot of like Feral Mage or Rogue Mage, stuff like that, or comps that are very, very aggressive. So this can do really well with double melee, especially since your dome will get really good value if you just throw it on top of your melee who stand right next to each other. So yeah, typically you want to play with really aggressive comps, comps with a lot of CC, or also comps that have ways of helping you, the priest, avoid getting CC'd. For example, playing with a Ret Paladin who can use Sank to get you out of fear and silence. They can use Bop to get you out of some stuns. So anything that has a lot of CC or help for when you get CC'd, and just a really aggressive team comp in general is typically what you want to play with. So warriors, rogues, hunters, mages, Ret Paladins, stuff like that. So yeah, that's going to be the end of the video. I'm really looking forward to seeing how Disc Priest performs in the rest of the season. And if you've made it this far into the video, I hope that maybe I've helped you out in some way, or maybe you've learned something from this video. And if I have, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.